Racist judge frames black woman, not knowing she's an undercover FBI agent. In a sweltering Atlanta courtroom, Judge Raymond Carver slams his gavel, sentencing Tiana Brooks, a 32-year-old black woman, to 20 years for stealing a purse she never even touched. Her mother's wail cuts through the silence as Carver smirks, oblivious to the truth. Tiana is an undercover FBI agent who has spent years gathering evidence against his corruption. A faint, chilling smile flickers across her face as deputies drag her away, a spark that will ignite the collapse of his empire. This isn't her downfall. It's the beginning of his. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you stand for justice against all odds, hit like and subscribe for more stories that expose the truth and spark change. Tiana Brooks sat on the edge of a rusted metal bench in a dimly lit holding cell beneath the Fulton County Courthouse. Her orange jumpsuit itched against her skin like a cheap disguise she couldn't wait to shed. The air reeked of sweat and bleach, the stench clinging to the cracked concrete walls. She crossed her arms, her dark eyes scanning the shadows, her mind replaying the last 2 years she'd spent infiltrating Judge Raymond Carver's corrupt empire. She had posed as a paralegal, a delivery driver, a janitor, each role allowing her to plant tiny cameras in his chambers, microphones in his golf bags, and forged bribe receipts in his desk drawers. Every smirk he gave while sentencing black defendants to decades behind bars for nothing, every backroom deal with shady lawyers. She had recorded it all. Today was supposed to be the payoff. Get framed, take the hit, then let the feds storm in with arrest warrants. Her handler, Agent Derek Miles, had promised she'd be extracted by sundown. Carver would be in cuffs, and the whole rotten machine would come crashing down. Her lips twitched with the ghost of a smile as she pictured Carver's smug face twisting into panic. She had endured the crack of his gavel. Now it was her turn to strike. But the cell door didn't move. Hours passed, sunlight fading through a grimy high window until the room was swallowed by gray and cold. Tiana tapped her knee, a steady rhythm to keep her nerves in check. She trusted Derek, a wiry ex-Marine with a scar down his left cheek and a knack for busting crooked cops. He had never let her down in their 6 years working together, from Chicago drug rings to Miami smuggling operations. Still, the silence gnawed at her. She stood and paced the cramped 5-by-7-foot space, her sneakers squeaking against the damp floor. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a prickle like static before a storm. Across town, in his oak-paneled chambers overlooking Peachtree Street, Judge Raymond Carver leaned back in his leather chair, a sweating glass of bourbon in hand. At 63, with silver hair slicked tight and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, he carried himself like a king who had never lost a battle. His wire-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose as he skimmed Tiana's thin case file, the one he had padded with lies about a stolen purse from a downtown boutique. It was a minor charge, a slap on the wrist for anyone else, but he had made it 20 years. Because she was black. Because she had met his gaze in court without flinching. Because he could. He had built his career on crushing people like her, stacking sentences to keep Atlanta's private prisons full and his bank account even fuller with kickbacks. But something about Tiana Brooks nagged at him. She hadn't begged, hadn't cried, hadn't even blinked when he handed down her sentence. That smile, the flicker of defiance, stuck in his throat like a splinter. He set his glass down hard, the clink echoing in the empty room. Buzzing his intercom, he summoned Victor Slade, his bailiff and personal enforcer. Slade filled the doorway, all 6 feet 4 inches of him. A former cop who had dodged a brutality charge thanks to Carver's influence. He kept his blonde hair buzzed short and his hands constantly flexing, like they missed breaking things. Carver tossed the file across the desk. Dig into this Brooks woman. Something's not right. She's too calm for some street trash caught red-handed. Slade's pale blue eyes narrowed. You think she's got a lawyer pulling strings? Carver snorted, sipping his bourbon. Maybe, or maybe she's just stupid. Either way, I want her buried. Find me dirt, Victor. Deep dirt. Back in the cell, Tiana heard the heavy thud of boots echoing down the hall. She straightened, expecting Derek's coded knock, a simple signal they had used for years. Instead, the door swung open, revealing a scrawny guard with a patchy beard and a smug grin. "Brooks, hands out. You're moving." Keeping her expression neutral, she extended her wrists as he clamped on the cuffs. But her pulse quickened. This wasn't the plan. The guard shoved her toward a dimly lit sally port where a black van idled, its exhaust choking the stale air. She climbed inside. The door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Tiana replayed her cover. Tiana Brooks, single, no kids, Atlanta temp worker, clean record until Carver's frame-up. Airtight, or so she had thought. Derek would fix this. He had to. Meanwhile, Slade sat in a dingy basement office beneath the courthouse, a flickering bulb casting shadows over a desk cluttered with coffee cups and cigarette butts. He cracked his knuckles and dialed a buddy still on the force, a guy who owed him favors. "Run a name for me. Tiana Brooks. Full history. No shortcuts." The cop grumbled but complied. An hour later, Slade had a report. Most of it matched her story: born in Decatur, high school diploma, odd jobs. But one detail snagged his attention. A driver's license issued 2 years ago had a discrepancy. A duplicate number, tied to a dead woman in Savannah. Slade's stomach twisted. He'd seen this before: government-issued fake IDs. Sloppy feds. His fingers tightened around his phone as he dialed Carver. "Boss, we got a problem," he said, voice low. "Brooks might be a plant. Her ID's fishy. Government-grade fishy." Carver's bourbon stopped halfway to his lips. His mind raced, recalling whispers he had ignored. Rumors of federal agents sniffing around Atlanta's courts. He had dismissed them, too careful to get caught, too smart to leave loose ends. But then Tiana's smile flickered in his memory, and a cold sweat beaded at his temple. "She's playing me," he muttered. The glass slammed onto the desk. Carver picked up the phone and dialed his contact at the jail, a warden who had been pocketing his bribes for years. "Tiana Brooks, triple her bail. No calls, no visitors. Lock her down tight," he ordered. The warden hesitated. "That's a stretch, Ray. She's small time." Carver's voice dropped to a growl. "Do it, or I'll find someone who will." He paused. "She's trouble." In the jail's intake room, Tiana stood under harsh fluorescent lights as a guard pressed her fingers onto an ink pad, rolling them against the paper. She had been here before, undercover, but this time felt different, heavier. The guard shoved her forward, guiding her into a cell block. She sank onto a cot, her arm brushing against the cold steel frame. She had done her part, taken the fall. By now, Derek's team should have been storming Carver's office, unsealing the warrants, collecting the files she had risked everything to plant. She could already picture the headlines. "Corrupt judge exposed." Her sacrifice would be worth it. She closed her eyes, counting the minutes, clinging to that hope. Then, a shadow loomed outside her cell. A guard, bald with a permanent sneer, tossed a clipboard at her feet. "Bail set. 300 grand. Cash only." He smirked. "Good luck, princess." Tiana's stomach dropped. That number wasn't meant for release, it was a cage. She picked up the clipboard and saw Carver's signature scrawled at the bottom. Her fists clenched. He wasn't just framing her, he was fighting back. Slade ended the call with Carver and leaned back in his chair, cracking his neck. He'd keep digging, finding more holes in her story. Carver wanted her buried, and Slade lived to deliver. He grabbed his jacket and headed for his truck, already plotting his next move. A late-night visit to Tiana's old apartment, the one she hadn't lived in since going deep undercover. If she was a Fed, there would be traces, and he would sniff them out. Back in her cell, Tiana stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had underestimated Carver, thought him too arrogant to suspect her. Now she was cut off, locked down, and the clock was ticking. Derek had to hurry, because Carver wasn't going to sit back and wait to lose. Tiana Brooks stepped off the clanging metal ramp of the transport van, swallowed by the razor-wire embrace of Fulton County Jail. Her wrists burned, the cuffs digging in deeper than necessary. The late afternoon sun turned the asphalt into a shimmering haze, rising around the squat gray building that loomed like a predator ready to consume her whole. She had been here before, undercover, slipping through these gates to plant bugs in the warden's office. But now, the weight of her orange jumpsuit felt suffocating. The plan was still on track, or so she told herself. Derek Miles, her handler, would use her arrest as the final domino to bring down Judge Raymond Carver's corrupt empire. She had seen the feds move fast before, raiding stash houses in under 12 hours. This would be no different. She squared her shoulders, her dark eyes flicking to the guard towers, and muttered under her breath, "Just hold on a little longer." The extraction was coming. It had to be. Inside, the air turned thick with mildew and shouts as guards marched her through intake. A burly officer with a buzz cut and a lazy eye shoved her against a wall, barking orders while his wiry partner rifled through her jumpsuit pockets. "Another thug off the streets," Buzzcut sneered, his voice laced with contempt as he snapped her booking photo. Tiana bit her tongue, keeping her expression unreadable. She had heard worse, felt worse, but the casual venom still stung, a reminder of why she had joined the FBI in the first place. They shoved her into a cell block. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind her, the echo rattling down the hall. She sank onto the cot, feeling the thin mattress sag beneath her weight, and she waited. Any minute now, Derek's team would storm Carver's chambers, hauling out the files she had spent 2 years risking her life to plant. She pictured Victor Slade, Carver's hulking enforcer, scrambling to explain the cameras she had hidden in his truck. A flicker of satisfaction burned in her chest. She had survived the setup. This was her win. But the hours stretched into an uneasy night. The fluorescent lights above hummed like a swarm of angry bees. Tiana paced, her sneakers scuffing against the concrete, her mind churning. Where was Derek? Had the warrants hit a snag? She had been in tighter spots before, like that sting in Memphis where she had dodged a cartel hit squad. But this silence felt heavier, more dangerous. At dawn, a new guard appeared. A squat man with a pockmarked face and a smirk that never reached his eyes. "Random search," he grunted, shoving her aside. She stood still, arms crossed as he tore through her cot, flipping the mattress, kicking her spare jumpsuit into a pile. Then he stopped, his hand disappearing into a slit in the mattress she hadn't even noticed. A second later, he pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white powder, holding it up like a trophy. Well, he said, grinning. "Looks like we got ourselves a dealer." Tiana's blood ran cold. "That's not mine," she said, her voice even, but her pulse hammering. The guard let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart." Within hours, she was back in chains, dragged into a holding room where a bored clerk typed up her new charges. Possession with intent to distribute. Life in prison loomed over her like a guillotine blade. Tiana's mind raced, piecing it together. Carver had done this. He had reached into the jail with his filthy hands, digging her grave even deeper. Tiana clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. Derek would fix this. He had to. Across town, Derek Miles sat in an unmarked sedan outside the FBI field office, his phone pressed to his ear, frustration tightening his scarred cheek. "What do you mean, delayed?" he snapped at his supervisor. The warrants for Carver's office were stalled. Some bureaucratic red tape, a jurisdictional dispute. Derek slammed his fist against the dashboard. Tiana was counting on him, and now this bogus drug charge had muddied everything. He dialed his contact at the jail, demanding answers, but the line cut dead. Carver's influence stretched like a spider's web, sticky, vast, and impossible to escape. And right now, Tiana was caught at its center. Back at the jail, tension buzzed through Tiana's cell block. Word of her supposed drug bust had spread fast, and now every pair of eyes followed her. At noon, she shuffled into the yard, the sun glaring off the chain-link fence. She kept her head down, moving along the edges, her training kicking in. Stay low, stay alive. But 3 inmates peeled away from a card game, their strides purposeful, hands tucked into waistbands. The leader, a wiry woman with a shaved head and a scar splitting her eyebrow, stepped in close, her breath thick with tobacco. "Heard you're a snitch," she hissed. Before Tiana could react, a shiv flashed. A sharp sting sliced across her left arm, blood blooming against her sleeve. She ducked, twisting away, then drove her elbow into Scar's nose. The crack of breaking bone echoed. Scar stumbled back, cursing. The other two lunged, fists swinging, but Tiana moved fast. She spun, kicking one in the knee, sending her sprawling. Shouts rang out. Guards rushed in, batons raised. Tiana lifted her hands, panting, blood dripping onto the dirt. She had held her own, kept her cover. She had won this round, but the victory soured fast. That evening, as a nurse stitched up her arm in the infirmary, the TV mounted on the wall flickered to life. A local news anchor's voice cut through the static. Breaking story out of Fulton County Jail. Tiana Brooks, recently sentenced for theft, now faces allegations of running a drug ring from behind bars. Sources claim she's a violent kingpin with ties to Atlanta's underworld. Tiana's jaw clenched, the needle in her arm forgotten. Her mugshot flashed on the screen, an intake photo that twisted her face into a scowl. Then came grainy footage from the yard fight, edited to make her look like the aggressor. The anchor continued. Judge Raymond Carver called the case a tragic example of unchecked crime. Tiana's stitches pulled tight as her fists clenched. Carver hadn't just planted drugs. He had turned her into a public enemy. In his chambers, Carver sipped his coffee, a smug grin tugging at his lips as he watched the broadcast. Victor Slade stood by the window, cracking his knuckles. "Told you she was trouble," he muttered. Carver nodded, setting his mug down. "She thought she could play me. Now the whole city hates her." He smirked. "Let's see her crawl out of this one." He had called in favors, paid off guards, fed the press lies. Tiana Brooks was finished, or so he believed. But as Tiana stared at that TV screen, a fire ignited in her gut. She had survived the shiv. She had beaten the odds. Carver thought he had crushed her, but all he had done was make her angrier, and she was going to make him regret it. Tiana Brooks sat on a cold metal bench in the infirmary, her left arm throbbing under fresh stitches. Each breath pulled at the wound, but her mind was razor-sharp, cutting through the chaos of the last 24 hours. The planted drugs, the shiv attack, the news branding her a kingpin. It all pointed to one man, Judge Raymond Carver. He wasn't just framing her. He was orchestrating a war to bury her alive. She had survived the attack, kept her cover. But the clock was ticking louder now, a relentless drumbeat in her skull. Derek Miles had to be close. She had seen him pull off miracles before, like in Detroit, when he busted her out of a gang-safe house with seconds to spare. He would come through. He always did. Across town, Derek hunched over the cracked dashboard of his unmarked sedan, parked in the shadows behind the FBI field office. His phone screen glowed in the dark, casting harsh lines across his scarred cheek as he scrolled through encrypted messages. The warrants for Carver's office were still tangled in red tape. Some judge in Carver's pocket was stalling the process. Worse, the jail had cut off all communication after the drug charge hit Tiana. He rubbed his temples, the weight of her trust pressing heavy on his chest. She was counting on him, and right now he was failing her. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Carla Vance, his second-in-command. "Found something. Meet me at the safe house. Urgent." Derek Scoot twisted. Carla was sharp, a 10-year vet with a nose for corruption. If she said it was urgent, it meant only one thing. Tiana was running out of time. Derek had a bad feeling. The timing felt off. But still, he fired up the engine and sped off, tires screeching against the wet pavement. If Carla had a lead, he had no choice but to follow it. Back at the jail, Tiana watched the infirmary clock tick past midnight. The red digits glowed like an accusation. She needed to reach Derek, needed to get the message out that Carver was doubling down. Her eyes flicked to the guard posted by the door, a lanky kid with acne scars and a nervous twitch. She had seen him flinch during the yard fight, heard him mumble apologies under his breath as he helped haul her to safety. He wasn't one of Carver's men. She leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "You got a pen?" He blinked, startled, then hesitated before pulling a stubby pencil from his pocket. She snatched it, quickly scrawling a coded message on a torn strip of bandage. C. Planting D. Move fast. T. She had taught Derek this cipher years ago, a blend of shorthand and symbols only they understood. Folding the note tightly, she held it out. Get this to Agent Derek Miles, FBI. Tell him it's life or death. The guard hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing, then took the note, slipping it into his sleeve. I'll try, he whispered before shuffling out. Tiana exhaled, her chest loosening. She had outmaneuvered the system, turned a crack into a lifeline. Now it was up to Derek. At the safe house, a crumbling duplex on Atlanta's west side, Derek met Carla under the dim flicker of a porch light. She stood stiffly, her short black hair tucked under a cap, hazel eyes scanning the shadows. What's the break? Derek asked, stepping inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and mildew, the walls peeling like old skin. Carla shut the door, locking it twice, then handed him a flash drive. Intercepted a call from Carver's office to the jail, she said. He's got someone on our team feeding him intel. That's how he knew to plant the drugs. Derek's stomach dropped. His grip tightened around the drive. Who? Carla's jaw tensed. Can't tell yet. The audio's garbled. But they've got Tiana's alias. Her real name. Everything. Derek swore, slamming his fist against the wall. A puff of plaster dust rained down as he jammed the drive into his laptop. The audio crackled, Carver's voice low and smug. She's a federal, keep her pinned. A woman's voice responded, muffled, distorted, but the betrayal cut deep. Derek grabbed his keys. I'm raiding Carver's office. Now, warrants or not, Tiana's exposed. At 3 a.m., Derek stormed the courthouse, kicking open Carver's chamber door with 4 agents at his back. The room reeked of power. Mahogany desk, half-drained bourbon bottles, framed photos of Carver shaking hands with grinning politicians. They tore through drawers, seizing files. Then Derek found it, Tiana's planted ledgers. Under blacklight, the ink glowed, revealing bribe records. His pulse hammered as he bagged a tape recorder, Carver's voice clear as day, promising a developer leniency for cash. This was it, the smoking gun. He grabbed his radio. Get me the jail. Now, we're pulling Tiana out. But before he could finish, his phone buzzed. It was the guard. Breathless, panicked. Got your message from Brooks, he said. She's in deep. A new charge hit an hour ago. Derek froze. What charge? The guard's voice cracked. Bribing an officer. 5 more years. Carver signed it himself. Back at the courthouse, now a ransacked mess. Carver stood by the window, sipping bourbon from a cracked glass. Victor Slade loomed behind him, his buzzed head gleaming under the moonlight. The feds hit us, Slade growled. Took half the files. Carver smirked. Doesn't matter. I torched the rest. He swirled the bourbon lazily. And Brooks? She's finished. The warning had come just in time. A woman's voice, his mole, had tipped him off using a burner phone. Carver had rushed to the courthouse, dousing key evidence in lighter fluid and setting it ablaze in a trash can out back. Then he called the jail, spun a lie about Tiana bribing a guard, twisted her coded note into something damning. An hour later, he sat as the night magistrate, his gavel slamming down like a thunderclap, adding 5 years to her sentence in a sham hearing. She's just a black crook who thinks she's clever, he sneered to the empty courtroom, his voice echoing against the walls. Not in my city. Tiana stood in her new cell, smaller, darker, the air thick with mold. The guard returned, head down, muttering. They twisted it. I'm sorry. She stared at the bars, her coded triumph reduced to dust. Derek's raid had landed. She could feel it, but Carver had countered faster, harder. Her arm ached, her head pounded, but her resolve hardened. She had trusted the kid, outplayed the yard. And now this. Carver wasn't just paranoid. He had eyes inside the feds. Derek didn't know who, but she did. Someone close. Someone who had sold her out. She sank onto the cot, mind racing. How many more moves did Carver have left? she'd find out soon enough. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the safe house, Derek replayed the audio, Carla hovering over his shoulder. The woman's voice nagged at him. Familiar, just out of reach. Then it clicked. He turned, staring at Carla. Her cap was pulled low, hands stuffed in her pockets. You! His gun hand twitched. She bolted for the door. Derek tackled her, slamming her to the floor. Why? He roared. Carla spat blood, eyes blazing. Carver pays better. She's just another casualty. Derek's world tilted. His team had been compromised, and Tiana was paying the price. He cuffed Carla, his mind spinning, grasping for a way to salvage the mission. But the damage was done. Carver had won this round. And Tiana? She was deeper in the hole than ever. Tiana Brooks slumped against the damp, crumbling wall of her new cell in Fulton County Jail. Her stitched arm throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Above her, the dim bulb flickered. She had been knocked down. Again. But she wasn't staying there. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of rust and despair. Her orange jumpsuit clung to her sweat-soaked skin. She had been locked down for 3 days since Carver's latest move, the bribery charge tightening its grip on her like a noose. Her coded message had triggered Derek's raid, and for a moment, she had felt a tremor of hope when the guard whispered about the feds storming the courthouse. Carver was cornered, his empire crumbling. She had taken his blows, the drugs, the shiv, the lies, and still she stood tall. The pressure was mounting, and she was certain he would break first. Closing her eyes, she pictured his silver hair damp with sweat as he faced a federal interrogation. This was her moment, the edge of victory she had clawed for. Outside, Atlanta's streets erupted into chaos. Protests surged like a tidal wave, fueled by a leaked mugshot of Tiana. Her bruised, defiant face splashed across X and Instagram. Hashtags like #FreeDiana and #CarverCorrupt trended as activists shared clips of her yard fight. What the news tried to spin as a smear campaign turned into proof of her targeting. Derek Miles added fuel to the fire, slipping Carver's sentencing records to a local blogger. 20 years for a black kid caught with a joint. Probation for a white executive embezzling millions. The numbers screamed injustice, and the city roared back. By noon, a crowd of 300 flooded Peachtree Street outside the courthouse, chanting her name, waving signs that read, "Justice for the framed." Derek stood among them, his face hidden under a hoodie, whispering to organizers. "She's one of us," he murmured. "Carver's going down." The air buzzed with fury. Tiana's name had become a rallying cry. She had won the people, even if she didn't know it yet. Inside his chambers, Judge Raymond Carver paced, his polished shoes scuffing against the hardwood. The bourbon in his glass trembled, mirroring the sweat beading on his forehead. Victor Slade loomed by the door, his buzzed head glistening, fists clenched like he was itching to break something. "They're out there screaming for her," Slade growled, nodding toward the window, where chants seeped through thick glass. Carver's lips curled into a sneer. "Let them scream," he spat. "She's a nobody, a black crook who got caught." But his voice wavered, betraying the cracks in his armor. The raid had stripped him of half his files. Now the mob was clawing at his throne. He had burned evidence, framed her again. But the heat was rising. He slammed his glass down, amber liquid splashing across his desk, and grabbed his phone. "Get me Channel 5. Now." At 3 p.m., Carver stepped onto the courthouse steps, cameras flashing like gunfire. His silver hair gleamed under the sun, wire-rimmed glasses catching the light as he adjusted his tie. The crowd booed, but he raised his hands, feigning calm. "I have served this city for 30 years, he began, his voice smooth as oil. "Tiana Brooks is a violent criminal, a drug dealer who attacked her own in jail." Crocodile tears welled in his eyes. He dabbed them away with a handkerchief, a perfectly rehearsed display. "I weep for the chaos she has caused," he continued, his voice breaking just enough to sound heartfelt. "We need law and order, not radicals tearing us apart." The broadcast cut to Tiana's mugshot, then looped the yard fight on repeat. The narrative twisted, painting her as a menace. Commentators nodded, parroting Carver's lies. "She's a cop hater," one said. "A threat to Atlanta," another agreed. Carver smirked as he stepped back inside. He was certain he had flipped the script. The mob would turn on her now. Tiana felt the shift before she saw it. In her cell, a guard switched on the TV bolted to the wall, cranking the volume high. Carver's face filled the screen, his fake tears glistening, his words twisting her into a monster. Her stomach knotted, but she kept her face blank, years of training keeping her steady. The protests would force his hand, she had thought, crack his defenses. She had won the streets, hadn't she? But as the broadcast ended, the guard smirked. "Guess you're done, huh?" he muttered. Her hope flickered, a candle in a storm. If the people turned, Carver might survive this. She pressed her palms to her eyes, willing Derek to move faster. He had the files, the proof. He would make this right. Then the ground shook. At 5 p.m., Tiana's transport van rolled out of the jail, a routine transfer to a downtown holding facility. She sat cuffed in the back, her stitched arm pressed against the cool metal wall, her mind racing. The protests had to be working. Derek wouldn't let Carver's lies stand. But as the van turned onto MLK Drive, a roar swallowed the engine's hum. A mob surged from the shadows, 24 strong, their faces twisted with rage. Not her supporters. Carver's spin had flipped them. Rocks smashed against the windshield, glass exploding inward as the driver swerved. "Cop killer!" they screamed, voices thick with hatred. Slurs cut through the air like blades. Tiana's heart slammed against her ribs. The van rocked, tires screeching as fists pounded the sides. A brick crashed through her window, showering her in shards. One sliced her cheek, warm blood trickling down as she ducked, the cuffs biting into her wrists. The driver floored it, but the mob chased. A pickup truck rammed the rear bumper. "String her up," a man bellowed, his voice raw with venom. A noose swung from his hand. Tiana's breath caught, her training warred with primal fear. She had faced guns, knives, but this was a lynching, ugly, pure, fueled by Carver's poison. The van lurched forward, tires bursting on shattered glass. She braced for the end. Then sirens, wailing, red and blue lights pierced the dusk. Cops swarmed in, batons swinging, but they moved slow, reluctant, their eyes cold as they glanced at her through the shattered window. "Move it," one barked to the driver, not the mob. His sneer made it clear. She wasn't worth saving. The van limped forward, the crowd scattering. But Tiana's chest heaved, blood staining the seat beneath her. She had thought the people were her shield. Now they were Carver's weapon. In his chambers, Carver watched the news replay the attack. A grin split his face. "Told you she'd fall," he said to Slade, pouring another bourbon. "They'll tear her apart before the feds can blink." Slade nodded, cracking his knuckles. "Streets are ours again." Carver leaned back, savoring the chaos he had unleashed. Tiana's moment, the protests, had been her peak, and he had turned it into her grave. But in the van, Tiana wiped the blood from her cheek. Her eyes narrowed. She had survived barely. Carver thought he had broken her, but all he had done was light a fuse. This wasn't her downfall. It was his mistake. What's your take on Carver turning Tiana's own supporters against her? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think the snake has gone beyond redemption, or a 2 if you're betting on Tiana to rise from the ashes. Hit that like button if you're stunned by how fast justice can flip, and subscribe to see if she can claw her way back from the edge. Can Derek turn the tide with those seized files, or has Carver's mob just handed him the knockout punch? Stay tuned to find out what's brewing in the shadows. Tiana Brooks lay on a cot in Fulton County Jail's infirmary, her cheek burning from the glass cut she had taken during the mob attack. Her stitched arm throbbed under a fresh bandage. The room smelled of iodine and despair, the walls a sickly shade of green that reflected the flickering fluorescent light overhead. Her orange jumpsuit was torn at the shoulder, blood and grime smudging the fabric. But her eyes burned with a fire that had never dimmed. The van assault had shaken her, the noose swinging in that man's hand replaying in her mind like a nightmare on loop. She had survived, barely, thanks to the cops who had dragged their feet before stepping in. The protests had turned against her, Carver's lies sinking deep into Atlanta's streets. But she wasn't done. Derek Miles had the files. The proof. She had planted it over 2 years, feeling the ripples of each raid, knowing he was close to cracking Carver wide open. She just had to hold on, find a way to push back from inside these walls. The infirmary door creaked open, and a nurse shuffled in, a wiry woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her braids and a face carved with exhaustion. She carried a tray of gauze and saline, her brown eyes flicking to Tiana with a mix of pity and curiosity. "You're a tough one," she muttered, setting the tray down. "Heard about the van. Lucky you're still breathing." Tiana sat up, wincing as her arm protested. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," she said, her voice low but steady. She had seen this nurse before, slipping painkillers to inmates who couldn't pay, her hands quick and discreet. Not one of Carver's puppets. Tiana's mind clicked into gear. "You got access to the guard's break room?" The nurse paused, her hand hovering over the gauze. "Maybe." "Why?" Tiana leaned in, her whisper sharp. "I need something delivered. No questions." The nurse's eyes narrowed, but after a beat, she gave a small nod. Silent agreement. Sealed. Tiana tore a strip from her bandage, using a bent nail she had pried from the cot to scratch out a message. It was crude, no cipher this time, just raw truth. Carver's bribe ledger. Under his desk blotter. "Leak it, T." She had spotted the ledger months ago, posing as a janitor. Its leather cover was stained with bourbon rings, stuffed with names and dollar amounts. She had left it there, too hot to move then. But now it was her ace. She folded the strip tight and pressed it into the nurse's palm. "Get this to Agent Derek Miles, FBI. Tell him it's from the ghost in orange." The nurse slipped it into her pocket, her face unreadable, then shuffled out. Tiana sank back, her chest loosening. She had turned a shakedown into a lifeline once before. This was bigger. If Derek got that ledger, Carver's empire would burn. She had won this move. She was sure of it. Across town, Derek Miles sat in a cluttered FBI safe house, his laptop screen glowing with scanned files from Carver's office. His scarred cheek twitched as he sipped cold coffee, the sting of Carla's betrayal still raw. She was in custody, spilling names under pressure. But the damage lingered. He had trusted her, and Tiana had paid the price. The seized files were gold. Taped conversations, bribe receipts, enough to bury Carver for a decade. But the warrants were still stalled, and Tiana was drowning under new charges. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Miles," he answered, voice tight. A woman's voice, rough, low. "Got a ghost's note for you. Check your drop spot." The line went dead. Derek bolted to the alley behind the safe house, fishing a crumpled bandage from a trash can. He unfolded it, reading Tiana's scrawled message. A grin flickered across his face. "That's my girl." He dialed a tech, barking orders to hack Channel 5's feed, then raced to leak the ledger online. By midnight, it hit, page after page of Carver's handwriting. Payoffs from prison CEOs, developers, cops, all live for the world to see. Twitter exploded. #CarverCaught trended. Screenshots spread like wildfire. In his chambers, Judge Raymond Carver watched the leak unfold on his phone. His silver hair was disheveled, his bourbon glass empty. The ledger pages flashed across news sites, his signature glaring back at him. His hand shook as he scrolled. Then he roared, hurling the phone at the wall. Victor Slade stood nearby, his meaty hands flexing. "She's still fighting, boss." He cracked his knuckles. "From jail." Carver's face purpled, veins bulging. Not for long. He had lost files, burned others. But this was a gut punch. The protests, the raid, now this. His reputation was ash. His allies were scrambling to distance themselves. Carver grabbed a burner phone and called the warden, a greasy man who had pocketed his cash for years. "Stage a riot. Now, the warden hesitated. That's risky, Ray. Carver's voice dropped to a hiss. Do it, or you're next. At 6 a.m., Tiana woke to shouts echoing down the cell block. She had drifted off dreaming of Carver's arrest. The ledger, her knockout blow. She thought she had turned the tide, forced his hand. Then, the lights flared red, alarms blared, and chaos erupted. Inmates flooded the halls, fists swinging, trays smashing against bars. Guards shouted, batons cracking against skulls, but their eyes stayed locked on her cell. The door flew open, and the squat guard from the drug bust sneered. Troublemaking rat gets what's coming. He grabbed her roughly, shoving her into solitary confinement. A 6x4 box with no windows. Screams echoed through the walls. Then smoke, thick and black, curling under the door, filling the air with choking heat. Tiana pounded against the steel, coughing, her eyes burning as she squinted through the narrow slot. Flames licked at her old cell, her mattress a torch, her few belongings swallowed by fire. The warden's voice crackled through the intercom. Brooks started this. Let her burn. Tiana sank to her knees, the searing heat crawling toward her, the smoke clawing at her lungs. She had survived the mob. She had outplayed Carver with the ledger. But this was his counterstrike, a riot to erase her. Her victory had shattered his world, and now he had turned the jail into a furnace to bury her alive. Pressing her face to the floor, she gasped for air, her mind racing. Derek's leak had worked, but Carver wasn't folding, he was escalating. Ruthless, unhinged. The nurse had gotten through. She had bet her life on it, and now her life was the wager. She clawed at the slot, her stitches tearing open, blood slicking her fingers. This wasn't the end. She coughed through the thick haze. She'd find a way out, because Carver hadn't counted on her will to survive this hell. In his chambers, Carver stared at the jail security feed, the flames flickering in his cold reflection. Slade stood nearby, arms crossed. She's toast, Carver muttered, a twisted grin pulling at his lips. No Fed crawls out of that. Slade nodded, cracking his knuckles. Crowd's quiet now. You're back on top. Carver poured himself another bourbon, savoring the slow burn. Tiana's ledger leak had stung, but he had stung back harder. He thought she was finished, her ashes his trophy. But inside that burning box, Tiana felt her pulse steady. She had won the public, lost it, won it again. And now this? Carver's fire was his mistake. Because she wasn't ash yet. She was a spark, and she would ignite again. Tiana Brooks clawed at the steel door of her solitary cell, her lungs burning as smoke seeped through the slot, thick and acrid, a black veil choking every breath. Her stitches had torn open, blood slicking her fingers, painting streaks across the metal as she pounded against it. The riot's roar faded into a distant hum, but the heat pressed closer, Carver's flames devouring the walls outside. She had survived his frame-ups, his shiv attack, the mob, and she had turned his own ledger against him, crushing his reputation into the dirt. She had thought the leak was checkmate, the public's outrage her shield. But Carver had turned the jail into a pyre, and she was trapped, her victory curling into ash. She coughed, knees buckling, and pressed her face to the cold floor, sucking in thin threads of air through the crack. Not yet, she rasped, her voice a raw whisper. She would find a way out. She always did. Across town, Derek Miles paced the FBI safe house, his boots scuffing against the warped hardwood as he watched the hacked jail security feeds. A trembling tech had cracked them open, and now the images flickered across his laptop screen. Flames danced, inmates scattered, guards swung batons. Derek's scarred cheek twitched, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles cracked. Tiana's ledger leak had blown Carver's world apart. Hashtags trending, the story lighting up news feeds. But the riot news had hit him like a sucker punch. He had failed her again. Carla's betrayal was still a fresh wound. And now this. He grabbed his burner phone and dialed a federal judge, one he had blackmailed once over a DUI. His voice was sharp as a blade. I need an injunction. Now. Fulton County is burning, and my agent is inside. Move, now, or your career is next." The judge stammered, but Derek had already hung up. He was already dialing the jail. "Release Tiana Brooks. Federal order incoming." The warden sputtered. "She's in solitary. Riots out of control." Derek's growl cut through. "Get her out, or I'll bury you with Carver." At 7 a.m., the solitary door groaned open. A guard, his face streaked with soot, hauled Tiana to her feet. Her legs wobbled. Her jumpsuit was soaked with sweat and blood. But she straightened, her dark eyes blazing through the haze. "Move!" she snapped, shoving past him. The hall was a war zone. Smoke swirling, alarms shrieking. But the guard led her to a sally port, where a black SUV idled. Derek's team, 2 agents in tactical gear, yanked her inside. Tires screeched. They peeled out. Tiana collapsed against the seat, gulping clean air, her chest heaving. "Safe house," she choked. The driver nodded, his jaw tight. 5 miles out. "You're free." Tiana's lips twitched, a flicker of triumph breaking through the exhaustion. She had survived the fire. Derek had pulled her out. Carver's riot had failed. She was free, or so she thought. The safe house was a brick ranch on Atlanta's outskirts, hidden behind overgrown pines, its windows boarded tight. Tiana stumbled inside, cradling her stitched arm against her ribs. The cut on her cheek was crusted with blood. Derek met her at the door, his scarred face softening for a split second before hardening again. "You're a damn tank," he muttered, shoving a water bottle into her hands. She chugged it, the cool liquid washing away the smoke's bitter taste. "The ledger?" she asked, wiping her mouth. Derek grinned, pulling up his laptop. "Carver's toast. Protests are back. Bigger. Feds are moving on him." Tiana sank onto the couch, its old springs creaking under her weight. She had done it. She had turned the jail into his grave instead of hers. She closed her eyes, letting the relief flood her veins. Freedom tasted sweet, even in this dusty hideout. But Carver wasn't done. In his chambers, he sat hunched over a burner phone, his silver hair plastered with sweat, an empty bourbon bottle beside him. Victor Slade stood nearby, his buzzed head gleaming under the dim light, eyes flicking toward the window where protest chants echoed faintly. The ledger leak had gutted him. His allies were jumping ship. His name was poison. The riot hadn't killed Tiana. She had slipped through again. He had underestimated her, but he wouldn't make that mistake twice. He dialed a techie he had bailed out of a hacking charge years ago, a twitchy kid named Bryce. "FBI's got a safe house network," Carver growled. "Crack it. Find her." Bryce hesitated. "That's big, Judge. They'll trace me." Carver's snarl cut through the line. "Do it, or I dig up your old charges." An hour later, Bryce texted coordinates. Tiana's location glowed on Carver's screen. A cold, vicious grin spread across his face. He dialed a dirty SWAT captain he owned. "She's a fugitive," Carver murmured. "Take her down." At 9 p.m., the safe house door exploded inward, with splintering as SWAT stormed in, rifles raised, flashlights slicing through the darkness. "Tiana Brooks, hands up!" the captain barked, his voice thick with venom. Gunfire erupted. Bullets sprayed the walls, glass shattering as Derek dove behind the couch, dragging Tiana down with him. "Fugitive my ass!" he shouted, firing back. Tiana's heart slammed against her ribs, her training kicking in. She grabbed a shard of broken glass, sliced through her cuffs, and bolted for the back. "Go!" Derek yelled, covering her. She crashed through a rear window, glass cutting her palms, and hit the dirt running. Pines whipped her face. Boots thundered behind her. Guns blazed, but she zigzagged through the trees, disappearing into the night. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed, but she escaped barely. She crouched in a ditch, mud soaking her jumpsuit, her pulse hammering in her ears as sirens faded. For a moment, she thought freedom was hers. The safe house had seemed like a sanctuary. Then headlights flared. She froze, A SWAT truck idled nearby, the captain barking orders. She's a cop killer now. Find her prints. Tiana's stomach dropped. She peeked through the brush, watching as they lifted a dead officer's gun from the wreckage. A gun she had never touched. Carver's voice crackled over their radios. Plant it. She's done. Her blood ran cold. He had hacked her location, turned a rescue into a massacre. And now he had framed her for murder. Her fingerprints, left in the safe house from years undercover, would seal it. She had escaped the fire, survived the mob, outlasted the jail. But this was worse. A death sentence, her name etched in blood. Derek limped from the safe house, blood trickling from a grazed shoulder, his team scattered or dead. He had gotten her out, thought she was safe. But Carver had struck back, ruthless and precise. Tiana huddled in the ditch, her mind racing. She had won her freedom for a heartbeat, only to lose it in a hail of bullets and lies. Carver wasn't just hunting her. He was rewriting her into a monster. She wiped mud from her face, her resolve hardening. He thought he'd caged her for good, but she'd claw her way out again. This wasn't her end. It was his misstep, and she'd make him pay. Tiana Brooks crouched in a muddy ditch on Atlanta's outskirts, her breath shallow, her orange jumpsuit soaked through with grime and sweat. Pine needles scratched her skin. The cut on her cheek stung, mingling with the ache of her torn stitches. The SWAT ambush had shattered her safe house. Derek's rescue had turned into a bloodbath. And now Carver's frame-up had branded her a cop killer. Her prints planted, her freedom gone. Sirens wailed in the distance, fading into the night. But she stayed low. Her dark eyes scanned the shadows. She had escaped the jail's fire, survived the mob's noose. And now this, her freedom ripped away in a storm of bullets. She wasn't safe, not with Carver's reach choking the city. But she wasn't dead either. She wiped mud from her hands, her mind racing. She needed cover, a way to strike back. She had gone dark before, vanished into Chicago's underbelly during a cartel sting. She could do it again. She stumbled through the woods, her legs trembling but relentless, until she reached the edge of Atlanta's south side. A sprawl of crumbling brick and flickering streetlights. The homeless network here was a ghost world she had tapped into undercover. A maze of alleys and abandoned lots, where people survived off the grid. She slipped into a tent city beneath a rusted overpass, the air thick with burnt plastic and unwashed bodies. A man with a gray beard and a limp squinted at her from a folding chair, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "You look like trouble," he rasped. Tiana knelt, keeping her voice low. "I'm running. Need a place to breathe." Joe studied her, then jerked his head toward a tarp strung between two pillars. "Hide there. Don't ask. Don't tell." She nodded, crawling under the tarp, her body sinking into a pile of damp blankets. She was off the map now, a shadow among shadows. But her next move? Tech. She had planted a backdoor in Carver's email years ago, a trick from her first FBI gig, posing as a courthouse IT lackey. She borrowed a burner phone from a kid trading batteries for cigarettes. Her fingers flew over the cracked screen, her heart pounding as Carver's inbox loaded. Threats to judges, payoffs to dirty cops, and a fresh email thread with Victor Slade. "She's loose. Find her." Tiana grinned, sharp, fleeting, and forwarded it all to Derek's encrypted drop, attaching a single note. "Alive. Use this." She hit send, then smashed the phone under her heel, scattering the pieces into a dumpster. By dawn, Derek leaked it online. The emails hit X like a bomb. Hashtag Carver Hunts trended within minutes. Screenshots spread like wildfire. Protests reignited louder, angrier. And by noon, Carver's suspension hit. The news flashed. Judge under fire. Removed pending probe. Tiana exhaled, her chest loosening. She had turned the manhunt into his humiliation. She had won herself some breathing room, or so she thought. In his chambers, now stripped of bourbon and paperwork, Judge Raymond Carver sat under dim light, his silver hair wild, his tie undone. The suspension notice glowed on his laptop as protest chants seeped through cracked windows. Victor Slade paced nearby, his buzzed head slick with sweat, his fists flexing. "She's a ghost," Slade growled. "Emails are everywhere." Carver's face twisted, a vein throbbing at his temple. The ledger, the riot, and now this. Tiana Brooks was a cockroach refusing to die. He had lost his bench and his allies, but not his fight. He grabbed a burner phone and called a contact he had kept in the dark, Eli Voss, leader of the Dixie Reapers, a white supremacist gang he had sprung from drug raps. "She's hiding Southside. Burn her out. 10 grand per head," Carver ordered. Voss's drawl crackled through the line. "Black Fed? Huh? Pleasure's mine." Carver slammed the phone down, a feral grin spreading across his face. "Let's see her dodge this." At dusk, Tiana huddled beneath the tarp, her stomach growling, her body aching but alert. Old Joe shuffled over, slipping her a stale sandwich. "Words out. You're hot." She nodded, tearing into the bread. She'd hacked Carver, turned the streets back in her favor. Derek would move soon. She could feel it. Then the sound of screeching tires split the air. Motorcycles roared in, a dozen strong. The Dixie Reapers with Confederate patches gleaming under sodium lights. Men in leather, fueled by hate, spilling out. "Where's the Black Plague?" Voss bellowed, his voice dripping venom. His bald head, tattooed with a swastika, gleamed in the light. Tiana dove deeper beneath the tarp as flames erupted. The tent city ignited like dry grass. Screams pierced the night. Bodies rushed to escape, and she bolted. Her lungs burned as smoke enveloped her, and she zigzagged through the chaos. Fire licked her heels. Her jumpsuit singed. Old Joe grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a storm drain. "Go!" he shouted. But a Reaper's bat cracked his skull, blood spraying as he crumpled. Tiana froze, her heart lurching, then ran, diving into the drain. A Molotov exploded behind her, shrapnel tearing through her calf. A hot spike of pain shot up her leg as she crawled through muck, blood trailing. Above, the Reapers torched another tent. A woman's scream cut short as flames consumed her. Tiana's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms. She had lost Joe, lost another ally, her win with the emails erased in a blaze of hate. She emerged in an alley, limping, her breath ragged. The glow of the fire painted the sky red. Carver hadn't just struck back, he had unleashed a massacre. In a downtown bar, Carver watched the news on a muted TV. Smoke rose from the south side. His lips curled into a smirk. "Cleaning the streets," he muttered to Slade, sipping a stolen beer. "She's gone now." Slade cracked his knuckles, nodding. "Reapers don't miss." The broadcast cut to Carver's leaked emails, protests swelling, but he didn't flinch. He had turned Tiana's refuge into a graveyard, her victory into a body count. He thought she was ashes, her fight snuffed out. But Tiana, bleeding in the alley, wiped soot from her face. Her eyes narrowed. She had hacked him, dodged his swat, and now this. She was dead, her shelter gone. But she wasn't broken. Carver's gang was his desperation, and she'd use it. She limped toward a payphone, her mind sharpening. He would pay for every scream, for every flame. Derek, holed up in a new safe house, saw the fire on his feed. His scarred cheek paled. "Tiana," he whispered, grabbing his gun. She had leaked the emails, turned the tide. But Carver had countered with blood. He dialed his team, barking orders. His voice tight. "Southside now. She's alive. Find her." He knew her, knew she'd survive. But the cost was piling up. Tiana, clutching the payphone, dialed Derek's drop. Her voice was a rasp. "Reapers, Carvers, I'm here." She hung up, sinking against the wall, her calf oozing, her resolve steel. She thought the streets were hers again, but Carver had burned them down. This wasn't her end. It was his next mistake, and she would make it his last. Tiana Brooks limped through a rain-slicked alley on Atlanta's south side, her orange jumpsuit tattered and blood-streaked, her calf pulsing with every step from the shrapnel wound she had taken in the Dixie Reaper firestorm. The payphone's dial tone still buzzed in her ears, her rasped message to Derek echoing in her skull. Reapers, Carvers, I'm here. She had survived the blaze that claimed old Joe and another. She had hacked Carver's emails, crashing his suspension into reality. But the cost had been a knife in her gut. Too many dead, their screams haunting her. She sank against a brick wall, the rain washing soot and blood into the gutter. She needed help, a lifeline beyond Derek's reach. Her sister Lena flashed in her mind, a nurse with steady hands and a safe apartment in Midtown. Tiana gritted her teeth, pushing off the wall. She had kept Lena out of this, but Carver's gang had changed the game. She had to move. She hitched a ride with a trucker who didn't ask questions, his rig rumbling through the city's veins until she slipped out, 3 blocks from Lena's place. The rain masked her escape. Tiana staggered as she climbed the fire escape, her sneakers squeaking on the wet metal. She tapped the window, and Lena's face appeared, her braids pulled tight, her brown eyes widening at Tiana's condition. "Jesus, T," Lena whispered, yanking her inside. The apartment smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a sharp contrast to the rot of jail. Lena, 35 and wiry, grabbed her medkit and stitched Tiana's calf with quick, practiced jabs. "What's this now?" she asked, her voice tight. Tiana slumped onto the couch, her stitched arm cradled. "Carver, Judge. He's after me." Lena's needle paused, her jaw clenching. "You're FBI?" "I knew it." Tiana nodded, exhaustion cracking her mask. "I'm safe here. Just need a night." Lena finished the stitches in silence. Tiana closed her eyes, the couch swallowing her. She'd made it to a haven at last. She woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds and Lena brewing coffee in the kitchen. Her calf ached, but the bleeding had stopped. Lena's work held strong. She had dodged Carver's Reapers and turned the streets against him again. This was her chance to regroup and plan with Derek. She sipped water, her mind sharpening. When the TV flickered on, a news headline scrolled. "Judge Carver suspended amid corruption probe." She grinned, fleeting but fierce. Her hack had landed, and Lena's roof was her shield. She thought she had one. A breath, a moment to strike back. But then the apartment door rattled, the faint buzz growing louder. Lena frowned, peering through the peephole, and gasped. "T, hide." Tiana bolted to the bedroom, her heart slamming in her chest as the door crashed open. Victor Slade stormed in, his buzzed head gleaming, a pistol in one hand and a phone streaming live in the other. 2 Dixie Reapers flanked him, their swastika tattoos shining under the fluorescent lights. Lena screamed as Slade grabbed her, wrenching her arms behind her back. The phone was shoved in her face. "Tiana Brooks," Slade bellowed, his voice booming through the live feed. "Come out or she's meat." Tiana froze behind the bedroom door, her breath shallow. The Reaper's boots scuffed the floor. The stream showed Lena, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with terror, blood trickling from a split lip. Carver's voice crackled through, cold and smug. "Surrender, or your sister's collateral damage for her kind." Tiana's stomach twisted, rage and fear colliding. He had found her and turned her sanctuary into a trap. Now Lena was the bait. She stepped out, hands raised, her face a mask of steel. "Let her go," she said, her voice low, cutting through the chaos. Slade grinned, tossing a rope to a Reaper who bound her wrists, the knots biting deep. "Good girl," he sneered, shoving her toward Lena. Tiana locked eyes with her sister, mouthing, "I'll fix this." She tried to steel herself, save Lena, end this here. Slade dragged them to a van, the live feed still rolling, thousands watching as he drove to a warehouse on the city's edge. Its rusted walls loomed like a tomb. Inside, he tied Lena to a beam, his gun pressed to her temple. Then he turned to Tiana. "Boss wants a show." Carver's voice barked through the phone. "Shoot the sister. Lock her up." Tiana lunged, but a Reaper's fist cracked her jaw, dropping her to the concrete. The gunshot echoed, and Lena's scream pierced the air as blood sprayed from her leg. Tiana roared, thrashing against her ropes, but Slade kicked her ribs, her breath exploding out of her. "Stay down," he spat, dragging her to a basement. He shoved her in, the door slamming shut. Water rushed around her knees. The space was a flooded pit, the ceiling dripping, the walls slick with mold. Tiana's wrists bled. Her jaw throbbed, but her eyes burned as the water climbed to her waist. Carver had double-crossed her, shot Lena anyway, and now she was drowning. She had thought her sacrifice would free her sister, but he had played her. His cruelty was boundless. She clawed at the hatch, the cold biting her bones. Her mind raced. He would pay for this, for every drop of Lena's blood. In the warehouse, Slade wiped his gun. The live feed cut off as viewers screamed online. Carver watched from a bar, nursing a beer, his silver hair glinting under neon lights. "She's finished," he muttered to himself, a smirk twisting his lips. Lena's wound was a message. Tiana's trap, his triumph. He had lost his bench, his files, but he had crushed her spirit, or so he thought. Tiana, chest deep in water, found a rusted pipe jutting from the wall. She yanked it free, her hands shaking, and smashed the hatch's lock. The metal groaned as she climbed out, soaked and furious. Her sister's scream fueled her. Carver's victory had been a mirage, and she had turned it into his nightmare. Derek, holed up in a safe house, saw the stream before it cut off. His scarred cheek paled. "Lena," he whispered, grabbing his radio. Tiana was alive, he knew it, but this was Carver's deepest cut yet. He rallied his team, his voice a growl. "Warehouse District. Move." Tiana, dripping in the basement, tore a strip from her jumpsuit, tying her calf tight. She had lost her haven, her sister's safety, but not her fight. Carver thought he had drowned her, but she was rising, and he would feel the flood. How brutal was Carver's move to drag Lena into this? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think he's crossed every line imaginable, or a 2 if Tiana's escape proves she's a force he can't stop. Smash that like button if this family twist hit you hard, and subscribe to see her turn pain into power. Can Tiana save Lena from Carver's grip? Or will this basement be the start of an even darker plunge? Keep watching to see what rises from the wreckage. Tiana Brooks hauled herself out of the flooded basement in the warehouse. Her soaked orange jumpsuit clung to her shivering frame, water streaming from her braids, as she gripped the rusted pipe she had used to smash the hatch. Her jaw throbbed from Slade's punch. Her calf oozed blood through Lena's stitches, and her wrists burned raw from the ropes. The air was thick with mildew and the echo of her sister's scream. Lena's leg wound burned like a red-hot brand in her mind. She had traded herself to save her sister, thought she'd outsmarted Kara's sadistic game, but he had shot Lena anyway, double-crossing her with a grin. Now, she stood in the dark, dripping and furious, the cold concrete beneath her bare feet. She tore a strip from her sleeve, wrapping it tightly around her calf, her teeth gritted against the pain. Lena was upstairs, bleeding, and Tiana would get her out, no matter what. She crept up the creaking stairs, her pipe clutched like a lifeline, her ears straining for Slade's heavy boots or the Reaper's taunts. The warehouse loomed silent, its rusted beams casting jagged shadows beneath flickering bulbs. She found Lena tied to a beam, her face pale, blood pooling beneath her chair from the gunshot wound in her thigh. "Lena," she rasped, her voice weak but alive. Tiana dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she cut the ropes with the pipe's jagged edge. "Hold on," she whispered, her throat tight. The wound was a mess, flesh torn, but the bullet had missed the artery. She needed heat, something to stop the bleeding. She spotted a propane torch in the corner, left by the Reapers, and grabbed it. Her fingers fumbled to light it. The flame hissed, and she pressed the hot pipe to Lena's leg, cauterizing the wound. Lena's scream ripped through the silence, her body bucking, but Tiana held her steady, tears stinging her eyes. "I've got you," she said, her voice breaking. The bleeding slowed, a charred seal forming, and Lena slumped, panting. Tiana thought they'd make it now. Run to Derek's next safe house and end this nightmare. She hoisted Lena up, her sister's arms slung over her shoulder, and staggered toward the warehouse door. The night outside was still, the rain tapping on the roof, a deceptive calm after Slade's storm. Derek's voice crackled in her memory, his promise to find her after the live stream cut. He'd seen it. She knew it. He'd come. They limped into the yard, Lena's weight dragging her down. When headlights flared, tires screeching, 3 black SUVs roared in, FBI logos glinting on the sides. Derek leapt out, his scarred cheeks stark under the floodlights, his gun raised. "Tiana!" he shouted, agents fanning out behind him. They stormed the warehouse, cuffing 2 Reapers left guarding the vans, their swastika tattoos gleaming in the rain. Tiana's chest loosened, her knees buckling as Derek reached her, taking Lena's other arm. "Safe house now," he said, his voice a lifeline. She'd survived the flood, saved her sister, and Derek had her back. They'd won this round. The safe house was a concrete bunker 10 miles east, its steel door slamming shut as Derek's team hustled them inside. Tiana sank onto a cot, Lena beside her, a medic stitching her leg properly now. Derek paced, his radio crackling with updates. Reapers down, Carver's crew scrambling. He'd used the live stream to trace them. The feds are raiding Carver's bar hideout, hauling him in on assault charges. "He's on bail," Derek said, his jaw tight. "But we've got him." Tiana nodded, her head spinning but clear. The arrest was her victory. Lena's survival, her prize. She'd turned Carver's trap into his cage. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under, believing the worst was behind them. But Kara wasn't finished. Free on bail, he sat in a dingy motel room, his silver hair matted, his tie a noose around his neck. Victor Slade stood by the window, his buzzed head slick with sweat, a burner phone pressed to his ear. The arrest had stung, the Reaper's failure a slap, but Carver's mind churned with venom. Tiana had slipped again, her sister alive. The feds closing in. He'd lost his bench, his files, his gang, but he had one card left. He called a demolition guy, a jittery ex-con named Hank, sprung from an arson rap. "Bunker east of town. FBI spot. Blow it. 20 grand, Carver growled. Hank hesitated, his voice shaking. "That's feds." Carver's snarl cut through the phone. "Do it or I'll bury you." An hour later, Hank planted a bomb under the safe house, its timer ticking down, a red light pulsing in the dark. At midnight, the ground shook, a deafening roar splitting the silence. The safe house collapsed, concrete crumbling, steel twisting as flames erupted. Tiana jolted awake, Lena's scream piercing her ears as the cot flipped, debris raining down. She grabbed her sister, dragging her through dust and fire. Her lungs burned, her calf ripping open again. Derek shouted out, his voice lost in the chaos, but a beam crashed, pinning his leg. Tiana doubled back, heaving it off him, her arms trembling, blood slicking her hands. They stumbled into the night, smoke choking the air. The bunker was a blazing ruin. She thought they'd escaped, her heart pounding with relief, when a crack split the darkness. A sniper's bullet grazed her skull, blood pouring down her face. Her vision blurred. She fell to her knees, Lena catching her. Derek fired into the trees. Kara watched from the motel, a grainy feed on Slade's phone showing the explosion. His grin was feral. "Black troublemakers don't last," he muttered. The sniper's voice crackled through. "She's marked, a damn animal. One more shot." Slade nodded, cracking his knuckles. "Finish her." The blast had leveled her. Refuge, the bullet, her tombstone. He'd lost everything, but he'd take her with him. Tiana, blood dripping into her eyes, clutched Lena's hand, her head spinning. She'd saved her sister, thought Derek's raid was the end, but Kara had bombed her world and aimed for her skull. The sniper's scope gleamed in the distance, her breath shallow, her resolve flickering. She'd survived the warehouse, but this was near death. Carver's cruel voice echoed, "Stay down." As he scanned the dark, Tiana wiped the blood from her brow, her mind racing. She'd turned the live stream against Carver, gotten him cuffed, but he'd countered with a bomb and a bullet. Relentless and unhinged, she had thought she'd won, saved Lena, but now they were prey, hunted in the wreckage. Her fingers tightened around the pipe she'd grabbed, her pulse steadying. Carver thought he'd ended her, but she wasn't gone. Not yet. She'd rise from this, make him bleed for it, because this wasn't her grave. It was his miscalculation. Tiana Brooks crouched behind a splintered oak tree, blood streaming from the sniper's graze on her skull, matting her braids and blurring her vision as she clutched Lena's trembling hand. The safe house burned behind them, a roaring inferno of twisted steel and shattered concrete, the bomb's aftermath swallowing Derek's rescue in flames. Her orange jumpsuit hung in tatters, her calf wound oozing through its makeshift bandage, her stitched arm throbbing under the strain of dragging Lena from the rubble. Derek knelt beside her, his shoulder bleeding from a bullet graze, his gun raised as he scanned the dark woods for the sniper. Lena's leg, cauterized and stitched, seeped blood, her breath shallow but steady. Tiana's head pounded, but her grip tightened on the rusted pipe she'd salvaged. Her resolve was a steel thread in the chaos. She'd saved her sister, thought Kara's arrest was her victory, only to have him bomb her world and mark her for death. She wiped blood from her eyes, her jaw set. He'd pay for this. Derek hissed, "Stay low," his scarred cheek glistening with sweat as he fired into the trees. The sniper's scope gleamed briefly before vanishing. Tiana's mind raced, piecing it together. Carver was on bail, desperate, his empire crumbling under her leaks and Derek's raids. She'd turned the live stream against him, gotten him cuffed, and now he'd struck back with a bomb and a bullet. But she wasn't dead yet. She'd hacked his emails, survived his reapers, and clawed out of his trap. She could turn this too. "Derek," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "get me a phone." He nodded, fishing a burner from his vest, and she dialed a news station's tip line she'd memorized undercover. Her fingers shook, but her words were steel. Carver bombed an FBI safe house. Live feed now. She hung up, then hacked her traffic cam with the burner. The shaky signal streamed the fire live. Within minutes, X lit up, Kara kills trending, as choppers buzzed overhead, cameras catching the blaze. In his motel room, Judge Raymond Carver watched the feed on Slade's phone. His silver hair wild, his bourbon bottle empty, the explosion replayed. Tiana's voice crackled through. Her name, poison on every screen. "She's still alive," he snarled, hurling the phone at the wall. Victor Slade stood by him, his buzzed head slick with sweat, his fists flexing. The sniper missed. Carver's face twisted in fury. His suspension, his arrest, now this. Tiana Brooks was like a hydra, every cut sprouting a new head. He'd bombed her, shot at her, but she'd turned it public. His desperation was a noose tightening around his neck. He grabbed a burner and called his last ally, State Senator Paul Grayson, a man he'd funneled prison profits to for years. "Declare martial law," he barked. "Atlanta's out of control. She's the spark." Grayson hesitated, his voice thin. "That's extreme." Carver's growl cut through. "Do it or I'll drag you down with me." By dawn, Tiana's broadcast had sparked chaos. Protests erupted across Atlanta, 10,000 strong, choking downtown with signs and screams. News vans swarmed the safe house ruins. Derek's team pulled back as choppers circled. Tiana, Lena, and Derek slipped into a stolen pickup. Her head wound clotted, her pipe still clutched tight. She turned the bomb into Carver's confession, thought the public's rage would bury him for good. She leaned against the window, her breath fogging the glass, believing justice was hers at last. Then sirens wailed louder, sharper, and the radio crackled. Governor declares martial law in Atlanta. Riot police deployed to restore order. Tiana's stomach dropped. Her victory soured. Carver had countered, turning her exposure into his weapon. The truck jolted as armored vans roared past. Riot cops spilling out, shields raised, batons gleaming. They hit the south side first, tear gas blooming in thick clouds, screams piercing the morning. Tiana's eyes narrowed, her pulse racing. This wasn't just containment, it was war. The cops reached a hospital where Derek had stashed them, its brick walls a fragile shield. Inside, he barked, kicking the door open. Nurses scattered as they stumbled in, Lena collapsing on a gurney. Tiana's blood dripped onto the tile. She thought they'd hide, regroup, but boots thundered closer, riot gear clanking. The door burst open. 6 cops stormed in, their visors down, their voices thick with hate. "There's the black one," shouted one, slurs flying as they charged. Tiana swung her pipe, cracking a shield, but a baton slammed into her ribs, her breath exploding out. Another hit her skull, the graze splitting wider, and she fell, her vision swimming. They beat her senseless, boots stomping her legs, fists pounding her back, slurs raining down like blows. "Cop killer, trash," they roared, their rage fueled by Carver's lies. "Martial law, their license." Lena screamed, clinging to a cop, but he shoved her down, her stitched leg buckling. Derek fired, grazing one, but they tackled him, his gun skittering across the floor. Tiana's world darkened, blood pooling beneath her, her pipe rolling away. She'd exposed the bomb, thought the feds would close in, but Carver had turned the city into his fist, the cops his executioners. A captain loomed over her, his baton raised, when a screen flickered on the wall. Carver's face glared through a jail video call. "Never win," he smirked, his silver hair neat despite the cuffs. "You're nothing." The beating stopped, the cops dragging Lena away, her cry fading down the hall. Tiana lay broken, her ribs cracked, her skull a throbbing mess. Derek groaned beside her. They'd cuffed Carver, turned the public against him, but he'd countered with martial law, his allies unleashing hell. The hospital spun, her breath shallow, her victory shredded. She'd thought she'd broken him, but he'd broken her body and stolen Lena again. The captain kicked her once more, his boot grinding her cheek into the tile. "Stay down," he spat, leaving her in the dark. She'd survived the bomb, the bullet, but this was her breaking point. Carver's cruelties yet to come. In the jail, Carver leaned back, his smirk widening as the feed cut. "She's done," he muttered, his voice a rasp of glee. Slade had slipped him the call, his allies in the Senate pulling strings. Martial law was his masterstroke, the cops his hounds. He'd lost his bench, his freedom, but Tiana's blood was his prize. He thought she was finished, her spirit crushed under boots and rubble. But Tiana, sprawled on the hospital floor, felt a flicker in her chest. Her body screamed, her sister was gone, but her eyes opened, narrow slits of fire. Carver had overplayed, turned the city into a battlefield, and she'd use it. She'd rise, broken but unbowed, because this wasn't her end. It was his fatal error. Derek coughed, dragging himself to her, his shoulder a mess. "We're alive," he rasped, pulling her up. She nodded, blood dripping, her mind sharpening through the pain. She'd exposed him, survived his worst, and now he'd shown his hand. Martial law wasn't his win. It was her weapon, and she'd wield it to bury him for good. Tiana Brooks awoke in a secret FBI bunker, her body a map of pain. Ribs cracked, skull grazed, calf oozing through torn stitches, blood crusting her orange jumpsuit. The air was stale, metallic. The concrete walls a cold cocoon around a cot where she lay, her breath shallow but steady. Derek Miles hovered nearby, his scarred cheek pale, his shoulder bandaged from the hospital raid. Lena was gone, snatched by riot cops under Carver's martial law, her scream echoing in Tiana's skull. The beating had left her broken, but her eyes burned, her mind sharpening through the haze. She'd exposed Carver's bomb, turned Atlanta against him, thought his arrest was her win, but he'd unleashed the city's fists, stolen her sister, and she'd barely crawled out alive. She gripped the rusted pipe she'd clung to, her knuckles whitening. "Where are we?" she rasped. Derek's jaw tightened. "Underground. Feds pulled us out. Carver's still caged, but he's fighting." She sat up, wincing as her ribs protested, and grabbed Derek's burner phone. Her fingers, bruised and trembling, danced over the keys, hacking into a drone network she'd tapped into Undercover 2 years back. "He wants war," she muttered, syncing the feed to a news station live stream. "I'll give him one." The drones buzzed over Atlanta, capturing martial law's chaos. Tear gas choking streets, cops clubbing protesters, flames licking Southside ruins. She patched an audio from Carver's leaked email, his voice snarling about cleaning up black troublemakers, and sent it live. The feed crashed. His trial aired on every screen, jurors gaping, the courtroom erupting. "He bombed us," she recorded, her voice a roar. "Shot my sister. Turned the city into his weapon." Hashtag Carver Guilty trended. Protesters swelled to 20,000, a tidal wave of rage. Carver was convicted on the spot, life without parole. His gavels echo silenced forever. Tiana slumped back, her chest heaving. She turned his chaos into his chains. In the jail, Judge Raymond Carver sat in a holding cell, his silver hair matted, his suit swapped for a gray jumpsuit. The TV bolted to the wall blared Tiana's drone feed. His own words damning him as the judge's voice boomed, "Guilty on all counts." His fists slammed the bars, his snarl a caged beast's roar. Victor Slade had slipped him a burner before the verdict, whispering, "We're not done." Carver's allies, loyalists from the Senate and Reapers, hadn't abandoned him. He'd lost his bench, his freedom, but not his venom. He dialed a number, his voice low. "Bunker napalm now." A grunt replied, "On it." He'd burned her safe house, shot at her, crushed her with cops, and she'd still risen. This time, he'd scorch the earth, take her down with him. Tiana stood in the bunker, her pipe tapping her palm, Derek rigging defenses as agents scrambled. The trial feed looped, Carver's conviction her trophy, Lena's rescue her next move. She thought it was over, the city hers, his empire ash. Then the walls shook, a deafening blast splitting the silence. Flames roared through the vents, napalm igniting the air, a molten wave swallowing the bunker. Tiana's scream caught in her throat as she grabbed Derek, diving for a hatch. The heat seared her back, her jumpsuit melting into her skin, her braids singed. Agents shrieked, bodies crumpling in fire, the steel buckling around them. She kicked the hatch open, dragging Derek through. His shoulder tore wider, blood slicking her hands. They tumbled into a tunnel, flames licking their heels, the bunker collapsing in a fiery grave. She crawled, coughing, her lungs raw. Derek gasped beside her. The napalm's raw fade was replaced by silence. The tunnel, a lifeline beneath Atlanta's chaos. She moved forward. She'd turned the trial, buried Carver, but he'd struck back, his loyalists torching her last stand. Her victory was ash, her body screaming, but she wasn't finished. "Lena," she rasped, pushing on, her pipes scraping against the concrete. Derek's radio crackled with a faint signal. Kara's escaped. Courthouse breach. Tiana froze, her blood turning cold. He'd lost everything, a life in a cell, but he'd slipped the noose, his allies springing him free. She staggered to her feet, her mind racing. He'd burned her bunker, thought her dead, but she had survived once more. She'd find him, end this, because he'd made one last mistake. In a stolen sedan, speeding through back roads, Carver grinned, his silver hair wild. Slade was at the wheel. "She's gone," he muttered, clutching a burner. Feds too. The napalm had been his ace, his loyalist's final gift. But the radio buzzed with static, then a voice. "Brooks alive. Tunnel exit." His grin faltered, his fists clenching. Tiana Brooks, the ghost who wouldn't die. He'd turned her trial win into a massacre, escaped to finish her, but she had risen from the flames. He dialed a contact, his voice a hiss. Her mom's house, rigged with explosives. "She'll come." Slade nodded, flooring the gas. "End game," he growled. Carver thought he'd won, her bunker, his prize, but Tiana was alive and he'd lit her final fuse. Tiana emerged from the tunnel, soot-streaked and bleeding, Derek limping beside her. The city burned above, martial law crumbling under protests. Kara's escape had sparked the chaos. She had turned his trial into his doom, thought Lena was next, but the napalm had flipped it all. Her sister was out there, his prisoner or worse, and now he was free hunting her family. She spotted a payphone, smashed, but still working, and dialed. Derek, team, car's loose. Find Lena, she rasped, her voice cutting through the pain. Derek grabbed her arm, his eyes fierce. We'll get him. She nodded, her pipe tight in her fist. The bunker was gone, her wind torched, but she'd fight through the flames. Carver thought he'd broken her, but he had unleashed her, and he'd feel the heat. In a bar across town, Carver's feet cut as Slade drove, his smirk returning. He'd escaped, burned her world, and now her mother's house was his trap. Tiana had turned his trial against him, but he'd turned her victory into a war zone. He thought she'd run to family, die in the blast, her fight snuffed out, but Tiana, staggering through the night, felt her pulse steady. She'd survived his worst, and now he'd gone for her roots. He'd misjudged her, thought her broken, but she was a storm, and he'd faced the lightning. Derek patched his radio, calling in choppers, his voice a growl. He's targeting her mom. Move! Tiana's eyes narrowed, her mind locking onto Carver's next move. She'd turned his game, lost it in fire, but she'd rise again. He'd escaped, but she would hunt him because this wasn't her fall. It was his last stand, and she'd make it his grave. Tiana Brooks staggered through Atlanta's rain-soaked streets, her orange jumpsuit a shredded relic, blood seeping from her grazed skull and torn calf, her cracked ribs screaming with every step. Derek Miles limped beside her, his scarred cheeks slick with sweat, his shoulder bleeding through a makeshift bandage. His radio crackled with static as choppers buzzed overhead. The city was a war zone, martial law crumbling under protests sparked by her drone feed. Carver's trial crashing into his life sentence. She turned his napalm attack into her victory. Thought Lena's rescue was next, but his escape had flipped it. His loyalists had rigged her mother's house with explosives. She clutched the rusted pipe, her knuckles white, her dark eyes locked on the quiet street where her mom lived, a modest brick home glowing under sodium lights. He's there, she rasped, her voice sharp. Derek nodded, his gun raised. We end this. She crept through the backyard, rain masking her steps. Her heart pounded as she spotted the bomb's red blink beneath the porch. Wires snaked from a gas can, a timer ticking down to 30 seconds. She'd disarmed traps undercover, diffused cartel bombs in Miami, and now her mom's life hung on her hands. She dropped to her knees, mud soaking her, and yanked the pipe into the tangle, snapping the blue wire with a flick. The timer froze at 5 seconds, the red light fading. Her breath exploded out. Derek grabbed her shoulder, pulling her up. Clear, he whispered, but his eyes darted to the house. Shadows moved inside, a hulking figure by the window. Tiana's jaw tightened. Carver. He'd escaped jail, burned her bunker, and now he'd come for her roots. She'd saved the house, thought she'd outsmarted him, but the front door creaked open. He stepped out, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Judge Raymond Carver stood on the porch, his silver hair plastered with rain, his gray jumpsuit swapped for a stolen suit, his wire-rimmed glasses fogged, but his grin was feral. Victor Slade loomed behind him, his buzzed head shining, a shotgun cradled in his meaty hands, preserving order. Carver sneered, his voice dripping venom. Means cutting out trash like you. His gun trained on Tiana, his eyes wild with a decade's hate. She turned his empire to ash, his trial to a cage, his escape to this moment, and he'd end her here. You're nothing, he spat, his finger tightening. Tiana dropped the pipe, her hands rising, but her lips curled into a faint, chilling smile. The same one from that first courtroom day. She'd rigged her mic in her jumpsuit pocket, a trick from her undercover kit, streaming live to Derek's team in every news feed she'd hacked. Say it louder, she said, her voice steady for the world. Carver froze, his grin faltering as sirens wailed, choppers roaring closer, red and blue lights flooding the street. Derek dove behind a car, firing a warning shot that grazed Slade's arm. The shotgun clattered. Tiana lunged, tackling Carver. Her cracked ribs screamed as they hit the porch. His gun fired, the bullet whizzing past her ear, and she slammed her fist into his jaw, blood spraying from his split lip. Slade roared, charging, but Derek tackled him, fists pounding his buzzed skull. Cops swarmed, feds spilling from vans, their shouts drowning in the rain as they cuffed Carver. His glasses shattered on the concrete. "She's a fed," he screamed, thrashing. His confession went live for millions. Tiana stood panting, blood dripping down. Her face, her mic capturing every word. She turned his trap into his tomb, his hatred into her hammer. Inside, Lena stumbled out, her leg bandaged, her eyes wide but fierce. She had been held in the basement, freed by Derek's team as they breached. Tiana grabbed her, hugging her tightly, her chest heaving with relief. Kara's empire was dust, his escape a mirage. Her family was safe. She'd won, turned his final stand into her triumph. The city's rage was her shield. The feds shoved him into a van, his silver hair matted, his snarl fading as cameras flashed. She'd exposed him, survived his worst, and now he'd rot. But then, Lena pulled back, her hands shaking, a pistol glinting in her grip, one she'd taken from a fallen reaper. "No more," she whispered, her voice a broken shard, and before Tiana could react, Lena fired. The shot cracked the night, Kara's head snapping back, blood blooming on the courthouse steps as he crumpled, his eyes wide in shock. The feds froze, guns raised. Lena dropped the pistol, her hands trembling. "No more," she repeated, tears cutting through the soot on her face. Her leg buckled as she sank. Tiana caught her, her breath hitching, the rain washing blood into the gutter. Cops rushed in, cuffing Lena. Her sister's radicalized scream echoed as they dragged her away. Tiana stood stunned, staring at the handcuffs on Lena's wrists. Kara's body sprawled, the city's chaos a dull roar. "Justice isn't clean," she whispered, her voice lost in the storm. Her victory was bitter ash in her mouth. She'd turned his trap into her win, but Lena's shot flipped it all, a final twist carving a scar through her soul. Derek limped to her, his scarred cheek grim, his hand on her shoulder. "She broke," he said, his voice low. Tiana nodded, her eyes locked on Lena's retreating figure, the choppers circling, the protests erupting. A new Carver had framed her, burned her, hunted her family, and she had buried him. Her mic sealed his fate. But Lena, shattered by his cruelty, had taken the last blow. Her vengeance was a mirror to the system's rot. Tiana's legs buckled, Derek catching her. The pipe rolled into the mud. She thought justice was hers, a clean end, but it was messy, raw, a wound that wouldn't heal. The feds swarmed, securing the scene. Kara's blood pooled, Lena's cries fading, and Atlanta burned, riots flaring in the distance. In the jail, Victor Slade watched the news on a smuggled phone, his buzzed head bowed, his fists clenched. Kara was gone, his empire ash, but the Reapers lingered, their hatred ember waiting to flare. Tiana had won, turned his master into a corpse, but the cost was her sister's chains. Derek pulled her to a van, his voice a growl. "We'll fight for her." Tiana nodded, her eyes hollow, her body a wreck, but her spirit unbowed. She'd exposed Carver, survived his hell, and ended him live. But Lena's shot was the price, a twist she hadn't seen. The city's flames lit the sky. Justice left a bitter taste, and she slumped against the seat, whispering, "It's over," knowing it never truly would be. The rain fell harder, washing Carver's blood into the street. The feds sealed the house, the bomb a silent relic of his last gasp. Tiana's mic feed looped online, his confession a viral scar. Her victory was a jagged edge. She turned his hate into her weapon, saved her mom, lost her sister, and stood in the wreckage, a survivor in a city that wouldn't heal. Carver thought he'd break her, but she'd broken him. And Lena's bullet was the final echo, a justice too raw to claim. Tiana Brooks' journey, a black woman framed by a corrupt system, turned every blow, frame up, riot, and bomb into weapons, showing that ingenuity and grit can topple even the mightiest tyrants. Yet the story's heart lies in its brutal honesty. Justice isn't always clean. Lena's final shot, born from trauma, reveals how oppression scars not just the target but those they love, blurring the line between right and wrong. Carver's downfall proves that power built on hate is fragile, crumbling under the weight of truth. But the price Tiana pays, her sister's chains, underscores that victory can taste like ash. This tale demands we question who pays for justice and why, pushing us to see beyond the surface of systemic racism to its deep personal toll. It's a call to stand firm, to expose corruption, but also to brace for the fallout. Because real change leaves wounds. Tiana's unbroken spirit inspires, yet Lena's act haunts, reminding us that fighting darkness can spark light or ignite chaos. What side of justice do you stand on after this? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit like if this hit home and subscribe for more gripping tales. Share if you believe truth should burn bright, even when it hurts. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's to strength in the face of fire.